So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I hope everyone's having a great week so far. Before I turn it over to our amazing panelists, I'm going to introduce you to our great partners at Burlington English. So Robert Breitbart, take it over.
Well, hello, friends. And yes, I have to bold and double underline great panelists that you have today. I'm super excited. This is really an amazing team that you have bringing great information. And we at Burlington English are thrilled, to help sponsor this. And we're thrilled about the topic. We just love getting all the WIOA partners together, like we've got so many here. And with Burlington English, we really help you get the most from everything that you're going to hear. We like to call it our 3 steps to success, and that is laying the foundation with our Burlington core. Let's get learners at the true beginning levels thinking about a career. And so, as you can see, everything that teachers need to project lessons, everything that on this topic, everything that students need to get a really solid foundation so that they're ready for ESL and beyond. And let's give everybody the chance to start thinking about a true career pathway with our English for specific careers. But before that, our career exploration and soft skills, our virtual career counselor. Let's bring that to all learners, get them thinking once again about a career pathway, whether they're in the largest program in your state or, like I taught in many times, the smallest. Let's bring all the great things, like, again, a digital portfolio that everybody's putting together. And then again, lastly, for our English for specific careers, I don't want any learner to go into any type of career preparation cold. So let's make sure that they've got the kind of career specific vocabulary, real life dialogues that they're going to hear, not just in the workplace, but definitely in their IET or IELCE training. So with that, thanks to all of you for attending today. You're in for a really special treat. So hope to see you at a future event. And I look forward to sit back and take some great notes on today's webinar. Turn it back over to our friends at COABE. Thanks to Sharon, the board, and all of our presenters today.
Great. Thank you so much, Robert. We really appreciate your partnership over all these years there at Burlington English. And just, I always tell folks that Burlington English was our first webinar partner back in 2017, if you can imagine that, when we first started doing webinars. So thank you for your partnership all these years. So it's really an honor and a privilege to be here today with you as we talk about ways that we can increase access for our adult learners and how we can work more closely with different providers. I know this is something that's always top of mind at the local program level. And so really excited and grateful that Amanda Bergson-Shilcock from National Skills Coalition reached out and offered to bring this webinar together. So Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you to introduce all of our panelists, but I wanted to thank you all for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Huge thanks to COABE for providing this forum for us to have this conversation, and really big thanks to Burlington English and Robert for their ongoing support of this work. Many of you know me, but for those of you who don't, I'm Amanda Bergson-Shilcock. I'm a senior fellow at National Skills Coalition, where I specialize in adult education and immigrant issues. And it's a joy to be here with an absolute rock star lineup of panelists. Here's why we're doing this webinar. When I used to work in an adult education program in Philadelphia, we would sometimes see policy guidance that came down from the federal government, and it would be a memo. And usually our program administrator would take a look at it, see if it had any immediate implications. And then we'd kind of move on with our lives and our jobs, right? There has been some really important policy guidance that just came out from both the Department of Labor as well as some additional guidance from the Department of Education. And we think that breaking down that guidance can help you take advantage of it and make it real for your learners. And more importantly, help your learners get better access to the services that they, as taxpayers, are helping to fund, right? WIOA services are federally funded services. Our learners are helping to fund those services. And so when we think about it that way, it's important to make sure that people have equitable access to the programs and services in their communities that can help them to accomplish their goals around workforce, finding a job, getting a better job, building skills. So that's the purpose of today's webinar, right? Let's take a paper policy guidance and make it real for our learners. To do that, we have some folks here who can give you a walkthrough of what the guidance actually includes. And then we have a fellow practitioner and program director here who can kind of give you a perspective from the ground. So you'll be hearing first from Kim Vitelli from the U.S. Department of Labor's Employment Training Administration. She's going to walk you through what in DOL speak is called a TEGL, a Training and Employment Guidance Letter, TEGL. That just rolls right off the tongue there. Then you'll be hearing from LaToya Newson at the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. She'll be walking you through some new guidance from OCTAE that is particularly useful for adult learners. And then we're going to turn to Becky Raymond, whom some of you know already. Becky does terrific work at Scale It in Chicago, whom some of you may remember from their earlier iteration when they were the Chicago Citywide Literacy Coalition. They are the one-stop operator for 11 American Job Centers in Chicago. And what that means is that they are not just providing adult education Title II services under WIOA, but they are also part of the WIOA Title I system that provides workforce development services. So I'm going to turn it over to Kim in just a moment. She's going to walk you through some slides. I have some reassuring news for you. COABE will be posting these slides after today's webinar and emailing them out to you, so you don't have to hurry to take notes. And there is some rich detail in there that I know you're going to want to be able to go back to, so don't worry, you'll be able to do that. The very last thing I just want to say is, you know, for many of us in almost every state, with I think 4 exceptions, participating in adult education Title II programs does not typically require immigration work authorization. So some of us are serving undocumented immigrants as part of our programs, or even newly arrived humanitarian parolees or asylum seekers who haven't yet gotten their work authorization. Title I services in many cases do require that work authorization. And so this guidance speaks directly to that issue. And one of the reasons I'm excited to talk about it today is because I know how many of you are serving learners in these categories. So Kim, without further ado, over to you.
Thanks, Amanda. It's really good to be with everybody here. I am going to take a second to click a couple of buttons so that you can see my slides and I can see you. This will be like everybody watching me parallel park for a second. All right. Can you,
Perfect.
Amanda, can you see my slides?
You're great.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, everyone. Thanks again for having me here. I've just been so grateful to work with the brilliant LaToya Newson over at OCTAE. I've learned so much from working with Amanda and all of the National Skills Coalition. I've just really always appreciated COABE's passion for adult education. And anytime I get to be on the same webinar as a practitioner, I know I'm in the right place. So I knew that this was going to be an important webinar. There's so many different places where workforce and education programs and systems and stakeholders overlap. So I'm going to talk about that recent guidance that DOL put out, but I first want to sort of lay out the groundwork and the context for that guidance. Let me just tell a little family history about how our work overlaps. Oh, the second test. Can I change slides? Okay. Our shared authorizing statute, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which you'll hear me call WIOA, mandates that our programs work together. When I say our, I'm talking about the Title I and III programs under WIOA, along with adult education and vocational rehabilitation as well. WIOA mandates that our partners work together at multiple different intersections, things like strategic state plans, things like one-stop operations, performance measures. And those are really mandates on our operations. And so we also, across different federal agencies and across different systems, have also a shared definition of career pathways that really gives a framework for strategy and services. What some people call career pathways. We talk about a career pathways toolkit, but it's also integration education and training. Career pathways are particularly effective for adult learners, close to your heart, close to mine, for how it articulates stackable credentials, the need for multiple entries and exit ramps, the ability to earn and learn at the same time. So the Department of Education and Department of Labor and 10 other agencies worked together to develop a career pathways toolkit. I know it's on links. I know it's on DOL's technical assistance website, which we call Workforce GPS. So career pathways is our shared strategy and framework for working together. And I also want to talk about our values. Our acting secretary, Julie Sue, over at Department of Labor, has articulated a set of good jobs principles that is really driving our work in a lot of different, no matter where we are and what we're working on. So like all of you, we at the Department of Labor want to see job seekers and workers and learners all be able to make it into a good job. And to get there, we really have to be specific about what that means and not just use a slogan of a good job, but really be specific. So the good jobs principles name things that we all want in our jobs, like good pay and benefits. I mean, this is normally like the pot of gold at the end of a career pathway, right? A good paying job, definitely a key ingredient in good jobs, but it's not the only factor. We also all want a chance to compete for a job without discrimination blocking the door. We all want to have a voice in our workplaces. We want to know that we're safe at our workplace, it doesn't make us sick, and that we have a chance to grow our skills and advance even while we're working. The full description of all of the good jobs principles is on DOL's website, and you can see that particular site in the chat. These good jobs principles guide DOL's support for states that are supporting refugees, for states that are working to safely resettle newcomers. Anytime that we're assisting people vulnerable to labor exploitation, it's really the driving force behind our work for everybody. Everybody deserves a good job, sort of no matter where they come from, or what they're working on so far. So DOL has really worked to try to embed these good jobs principles into everything that we do. We've worked with other agencies to shape some of the infrastructure investments. We've published guidance on how workforce development grantees can structure their policies and practices to result in more customers getting good jobs. These are also things that really anybody, we don't, sort of corner the market on helping workers find jobs. So adult education practitioners and all kinds of folks are interacting with workers to help them find work. So all of us can help job seekers identify a good job while they're in their job search, helping job seekers identify and know their worker rights right from the start, helping employers turn more jobs into good jobs, adjusting their recruiting practices, adjusting their sort of workplace practices. So we've done a lot of work to help people understand what job quality and good jobs means and how to implement that in technical assistance and in tilting our resources and our competitive funding opportunities to also drive towards good quality jobs. So if good jobs are what we aim for, then yes, WIOA can is how we do it. Yes, WIOA can is the catchphrase that our acting secretary uses to describe the immense flexibility within WIOA, if only we can get out of our own way. It's really been a call to action for both state workforce agencies and local workforce areas, and also for ETA to make sure that we were supporting flexibility. Now, when we held listening sessions with our grantees at the state and local levels, and also with our nonprofit competitive grantees, a couple different common pain points came through, and we've been working to address these through technical assistance, and then where needed, updates to our guidance, like TEGL 1023. We issued guidance on equitable access to training, underlying a couple different practices that people can take to make occupational training more available to more people, and also underlying the allowability of evidence-based services that help people finish occupational training, things like supportive services and good career information. We've also published guidance about outreach, clarifying that outreach is not only allowable, but really encouraged and important to do in the different ways that a grantee can conduct outreach to let people know that services are available within the American Job Center or wherever they're delivering their services. And then most recently, we issued guidance on reducing administrative barriers to improve customer experience. So we heard in listening sessions that it could sometimes take a very long time to get somebody enrolled in a WIOA Title I program. In some cases, this was taking weeks of paperwork. That's really frustrating for customers who might be in an economic crisis and they really need quicker help. And it's also frustrating for the staff in the American Job Center. They want to be helping people. They don't want to be they don't want to just be pushing paper, right? So eligibility determinations do matter. There's eligibility criteria in our statute, and we want to adhere to our statute. But we also want American Job Center staff, program staff, working to deliver services. So being able to sort of balance those two, our guidance is intended to help states and local areas adjust their policies and practices to streamline intake and eligibility processes. This will improve every job seeker's customer experience, and it's also a matter of equity. This can help us ensure equitable access for everybody. So the guidance itself is about 10 pages long, but there's a few main takeaways. One of them is that participants are not required to provide social security numbers for eligibility or for provision of services. Now, for WIOA Titles 1 and 3, grantees must request a participant or an applicant's social security number. Those social security numbers are the key to a lot of different performance information that we get through wage records, but we cannot deny services. Grantees cannot deny services if participants choose not to disclose their social security number. This is not new policy, but we find that we often have to remind people of this, so we underline this in our guidance. Another takeaway in our guidance is that self-attestation is a viable option for the documentation of most eligibility requirements. Not every single one of them, but most of them. It won't be the first thing that grantees use. It shouldn't be the only thing that our grantees are using to determine whether or not someone's eligible for a program, but it can be used. And after self-attestation has been used, our grantees don't need to keep chasing people for further documentation. Once we have self-attestation, once it's been determined that self-attestation can be used and it's in the file, that participant's good to go. It's also only necessary for our grantees to collect documentation about eligibility. Those are the characteristics that people have that make them eligible for the program, right? What their age is for a youth program, what their income level is for the for certain programs, and not even the WIOA adult program. Income's not even accurate there. It's a priority, but not an eligibility criteria. Whether or not someone lost their job, that's an eligibility criteria for the dislocated worker program. So we do need to collect documentation about the characteristics that determines that someone's eligible. And that documentation at times can be self-attestation. This is to say that grantees don't need to collect a piece of paper for every single characteristic of a person. You've maybe heard about the PEARL, that's the record layout for all the performance reporting information. It's got a ton of characteristics. We're gathering information about the people that we serve so that we can tell how we're doing and that we can see where there might be differences in sort of access into the program, success once people are in the program so that we can align make changes to the programs, align them to people's needs. So there's lots of different characteristics that we might capture about somebody. But we don't need to collect a piece of paper for every one of those characteristics. The place that we want our grantees to focus on eligibility about that documentation is just for eligibility. So documentation matters for eligibility. That documentation can be self-attestation. We don't need to collect paper for every single characteristic of a person. Believe it or not, this is not new policy, but it is something that we needed to really underline in our program guidance. These are sort of facts that are typically sort of associated and live inside performance guidance, and that doesn't always necessarily make it down to the ground level. The part that is new information and new policy in this guidance is that work authorization is not required to be verified for many services. And our ETA grantees don't need to verify work authorization until a participant is receiving a service that does require it. So work authorization verification is required for some types of services. And that's due to our own statute as well as the PRORA statute. These services, training, work experience, placing somebody in a job, supportive services that are cash or similar to a voucher, like a transportation voucher, those are all things that do require work authorization verification. But there's services outside of that for which work authorization is not required to be verified. So this guidance gives grantees a little bit more freedom to start serving folks earlier in the process. And look, lots and lots of people have complicated lives. They might not be able to produce work authorization documentation even when they have it. This can be true for young people, people who are leaving foster care, people who have survived a disaster, people who are returning to the community from incarceration. Not everybody has an entire dossier about all of their life history and their work history and their work authorization sort of easily available to them. So we can start services and begin services without validating work authorization. We don't need to check work authorization until someone is receiving a service that does require that work authorization.
Kim, I'm just going to jump in here to say we have about 3 minutes before we move on to the next presenter. I want to make sure you have time to get through the rich material that you're sharing with folks here.
Thanks, Amanda. If all I showed you was this slide, then we're actually in good shape. People who are in a process of getting their work authorization can start services, but they can't start occupational training until they have work authorization. I know this is different for the eligibility determinations for Title II. And what I'm naming here is different than how we used to talk about it. We used to talk about really black and white. Someone had to have work authorization, period. And this guidance breaks it down a little bit more about what we can start even before we get that work authorization. With my last minute, I'm going to jump ahead just to show you this. These are the services that do not require work authorization verification. A lot of different parts of labor exchange, sharing labor market information, doing career exploration, career guidance, resume writing, referral to community resources, sharing information about worker rights and where to find legal assistance, particularly important for a lot of vulnerable populations. Some individualized services also fall into this bucket, helping someone with English language instruction or obtaining their high school equivalency, and assistance in completing the paperwork to finalize their own work authorization or in applying for an occupational license. And these are all things that do not require work authorization. There are things that do require work authorization. These are the things that I named: job placement, training, work experience, and supportive services. Let me stop sharing here and just say that the guidance itself is pretty long and detailed, but I hope I've given you an overview of the main points of that guidance, and happy to answer questions when we get to that point later in the presentation.
Thanks so much, Kim. I know folks are going to be really excited to ask questions. And I do want to, again, reiterate for those of you who've joined in the last little bit, we'll be hearing now from LaToya tongue twister here, LaToya Newson of the U.S. Department of Education. Then we'll be hearing from Becky Raymond, and then we'll be opening it up for questions for all three presenters. If you take nothing else away from Kim's presentation, I hope that what you take away is the federal government is shifting to a more full-throated endorsement of, yes, WIOA can serve people in more expansive ways. It is clarification of existing guidance. It is not new policy, but as Kim said, a lot of this policy has been kind of buried in performance reporting guidance or otherwise not really intuitive for a lot of us practitioners to understand. And so it is a huge step forward for the adult learners that we advocate for to have the federal government really staking out such clear guidance. LaToya, let me turn things over to you to talk a little bit about things from Octay's perspective.
All right, thank you so much, Amanda. It was great to share a screen and share a virtual stage with my friend Kim. We have an opportunity to talk weekly about our different programs, and Kim had the opportunity to present at our annual state directors meeting. So I just wanted to provide just a little bit of context and information of a program memorandum we shared back in January of this year. And it references back to what I hear a lot, especially as a local practitioner and working at the state level, questions that would come about regarding child dependent care and transportation costs and the utilization of Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, or AFLA funds, for those types of services. And this program memorandum, which is in the chat now, Robert, thank you for sharing that, references some of the frequently asked questions we're receiving in regards to those questions coming from states. And it's very interesting to report that back in 2018, 2019, that only 29.2% of AFLA funded providers were reported to spending funds on supportive services, particularly child care, dependent care, and transportation costs. So this document really sets out to clarify what funds are able to be utilized for what supportive services. And for our supportive services under the Title II umbrella, it delves directly into paying for costs related to child care, dependent care, and transportation costs. So if you walk through this document, we're going to answer those questions. May AFLA funds, number one, be used for these types of services? And the answer is yes. If you go back and reference the document, we really talk a lot about CFR 200 and what it's referenced in the uniform guidance. We primarily, and under the umbrella of supportive services, really focus in on those services that are related to AFLA program services and enabling individual to engage in our programming. And those primarily are related to childcare, dependent care, and transportation costs. Any of those other costs are not utilized or not able to be utilized using AFLA funds, but there is reference to, if you look at number 2 in that document, it is referenced that we are really intentional about specifying that states should consider whether eligible providers' activities offer flexible schedules or coordination with federal, state, and other local programs for supportive services, such as mental health, housing, any of those types of services. Anything that we can work in coordination with our other title partners or other agencies within your state or local areas. I really like to give reference to this document because it does clarify that the purpose is not to supplant any of the funding that exists within your state, but if those funds are not being utilized, you do have the ability to utilize AFLA funding to take care or support those costs as long as they're reasonable and allocable to the program. I would encourage each one of you, again, this was shared back in January of this year, but if you have not had an opportunity to review this document, take time to read through it. If you have any additional questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to your area coordinator here at the Office of Career Technical and Adult Education, your area coordinators, whether it be Michael Tilley. I like to give a shout out to my team, Michael Tilley, Stephanie Washington, Megan Baker, or Shanae Boston. We're happy to answer any of those questions. If you have anything specific to your funding and how to utilize those funding, you can also reach out to nrs@ed.gov. We're happy to answer any of those questions that you may have as it relates to this if you're not able to get in contact with your area coordinator. But again, if you have any questions, I'm going to yield my floor. I don't have a lot of information to share. I think the document is really self-explanatory. And we're, like I said, excited to clarify a lot of the things that we're hearing as it relates to the primary barriers that we hear that hinder individuals from fully participating or engaging in adult education services within your state, specifically for AFLA-funded programs under Title II. So Amanda, thank you so much for this time, and I'll turn the floor back to you.
Thank you, LaToya, and we'll make sure that folks get a link to that program memoranda in terms of the link I know that was in the chat is not working for some folks. We'll make sure there is one that does work. Okay, so we've heard from the 30,000-foot level from our federal friends and partners about the guidance that the federal government is putting out. And that guidance gets sent, and I'm mentioning this for those of you who have frontline jobs and are working as instructors or career navigators or other student support specialists. This may not be something that's your bread and butter that you see every day coming across your desk. Those pieces of guidance and those policy memoranda are sent to your state directors of adult education. They are sent to your state workforce boards, your local workforce boards, depending on where that guidance is coming from, whether it's from the Department of Labor, the Department of Education. And usually that trickles down to the program administrator level. But the world is not perfect, and we know that sometimes information doesn't trickle down to where it needs to get to. So we have asked a really rock star presenter from the practitioner world to share with us a bit about the work that she's been doing on the ground. So Becky Raymond, again, is with Scale It, based in Chicago, Illinois. And Scale It is a WIOA Title II, or AFLA. It's a bit confusing that Congress gives the same piece of legislation two names, but it is the case. They're the same thing. Provider of services, and is also a one-stop operator operating 11 American job centers. And she has been thinking about and working on this issue of making sure that adult learners get access to the full range of services they need for several years, right? This has not started just because the federal government issued a policy guidance. And so one of the reasons we wanted to ask her to come and talk with all of you today is because she has that experience over the last number of years and can illuminate some aspects of this from a more ground level perspective, right? So Becky, your organization has its roots as an adult education coalition, as we've talked about. What have you learned over the past few years about making sure that adult learners get the navigation help they need to access the services they're eligible for?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, Amanda. It's really great to be here with Kim and LaToya. As Amanda said, I'm at Scale It, and we serve as the one-stop operator for LWIA 7 in Illinois, which encompasses Chicago and Cook County. And so that's, a big area. There are 10 American Job Centers in the area. And when I think of helping individuals navigate services at American Job Centers and through the network, two things really come to mind: cross-training and referrals. And my team has really focused in on that. So knowing from Title I, what are the universal services? What can individuals come into an American Job Center and expect to receive? So the list that Kim kind of oriented us to at the end of her presentation in terms of what can everyone get at an American Job Center is really important. And then unpacking all of the cross-training features of every title in WIOA is really important, so that when providers are working with an individual, that they can make what my team likes to call a quality referral. And we track referrals in American Job Centers here in Chicago. And we're thinking, what are good referrals? How do we make sure that we're matching people to the right service? When our referrals, kind of the referral to nowhere, because maybe a practitioner wasn't aware that this individual wouldn't qualify for this service. How do we get better at making the match for individuals at the centers? So my advice to practitioners is to find out when the monthly partner or quarterly meetings are at the American Job Center. How can you join in? How can you get to know the staff at the centers, so that it's also very relationship based? I mean, we do our work very much trying to understand everyone's competing priorities in the center, and how do we fit into that? How do we accommodate that? And how do we leverage that for individuals? But cross-training and referrals are really where we see this work like the rubber hitting the road.
I love that. And my old job in Philadelphia, we used to talk about the difference between a business card referral and a warm handshake referral, right? The business card is you just hand your learner a business card and say, here, I think you should try there. And the warm handshake is, when you pick up the phone and you call the caseworker at the other organization and you say, hey, I'm sending Becky over to you, and this is her story, and this is what I'm hoping she can get from you. And I love that. If any of you listening today are in charge of professional development for your organization, this is a great topic for PD, right? And so that example that Becky just gave of engaging with Title I partners and attending a monthly meeting or building those relationships, that kind of professional development training for your student success specialists, your career navigators, and even for your instructional staff can be really valuable. So this is a great PD area. Okay, so Becky, some individual American Job Centers, like the ones that Scale It, serves as the operator for in Chicago, have been working for a while to do what is sometimes called improving human-centered design, or reducing administrative barriers. Does having this new federal guidance give you any new opportunities to improve or clarify services?
Yes, absolutely. I love the guidance coming from Title II. childcare and transportation. We staff a team of career pathway navigators who have had access to barrier reduction funds through the state of Illinois. It's game changing. It could be transportation to have another meeting with the navigator. Childcare is right in there, but also things like clothing for interviews, all kinds of tools so that individuals can get that next level of support to get them on the right track. So important. And I think also what Kim is sharing, so critical. We have to really focus in on the universal services as a way of welcoming everyone into the center. How do we make the centers a place where people feel like there is something there for them? Many of you might know our staff member, Robert Guzman, who served as our first career pathway navigator. And he really expanded this notion, even to me, to say, there's so much in here for everybody, regardless of their immigration status. We have to get them in the door. We have to welcome them. We have to help them see. And that's really what we're trying to do here at Scale It as One Stop Operator and in deep coordination with Chicago Cook Workforce Partnership, that the centers are places people want to be, that somebody there will help them understand what is available to them. And of course, every service is not going to be available to every single person, but how do we lead in a way of engaging with the community where they see themselves in the center?
So important. And again, this is important if your adult education program is serving folks who are returning from incarceration, young people aging out of the foster system, unhoused people, folks who might be domestic violence survivors, right? There's a lot of different reasons that somebody might not have an immediately accessible piece of government issued identification, right? And so yes, we're talking a lot about immigrants, and that's important because many of the folks served in adult learner programs are immigrants, but there are a lot of other folks in the adult ed system who may face these barriers, and this is a part of equitable services for all of them.
Yes.
So Becky, hearing you talk, some folks may think, gosh, what you're describing in Chicago sounds kind of like a dream. What advice do you have for adult educators who are not working for organizations that operate any Title I services or American Job Centers, and who might even have been frustrated when they've tried in the past to get their Title I workforce partners to do a better job of serving adult learners?
I mean, I hear you. And then I also think we're hurting a lot of cats here in Chicago. I think sometimes in a smaller location, it might be a little bit easier to build a relationship. And I think we all have to understand each other's pain points in a way. I think that sometimes adult educators feel, oh, the Title I, they won't take my students. Understanding more deeply, what are the barriers? What are their goals? What are they trying to accomplish? There's definitely a way that we can dovetail our work. And again, going back to those universal services, resource room, assistance with a resume, labor market information. What are the things that are readily available that will overlap with adult ed? Sometimes it could be just taking a tour of the center or inviting someone from the center to your graduation. We've done a lot of that where it's having center staff come to graduation. That's the time when individuals could be really ready to move into the AJC. Maybe they've gotten their GED. We want to make that connection so that it's obvious to those individuals that there's a place for them. And I do want to say one thing I was thinking about in the follow-up, Amanda, around, we have a partnership with the Continuum of Care, All Chicago. So, thinking through individuals experiencing homelessness, we're building things that accommodate special populations in the centers. So it's not always readily available, that somebody who's unhoused feels, comfortable right away. So what can we do to build more engagement at the centers? I don't know. I just want to throw that out there. Finding the common ground between partners, realizing we're all in it together in this community of practice, all of that is at the hallmark of what we're trying to do here.
And I love the specific suggestion about inviting your Title I friends to your graduations and other important events. Some of you may remember Beverly Smith, who was formerly the state adult ed director for Georgia. And I remember a story from her several years ago where she talked about having adult learners serve as judges for an award that the local workforce board was, or the state workforce board was awarding. And that moment of having adult learners in that role really caused an aha for their workforce partners. And after that, they saw adult learners in a whole different light. And they thought, wait, maybe we could have an adult learner sit on our board. Maybe we could have an adult learner, be in an advisory capacity. And so, that helped them have a mental shift in how they were thinking about adult learners. Okay, we have purposely left a good chunk of time here for questions from all of you. I know there are some absolutely fabulous folks in the room virtually today. I've seen you all signing in from all over the country. Please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. We have one already. I have a few more questions that I can ask our panelists, but I'd rather give you an opportunity to ask your questions. So please go ahead and do that. And in the meantime, I'm going to ask our federal partners, each of them to take a crack at this first question. And I'm going to read it out loud just for accessibility reasons. So, who has access to the information collected for WIOA programs? In our country's recent history, information collected in certain programs has been shared with ICE, that's Immigration, Customs, and Enforcement, which creates a heightened level of fear for undocumented immigrants. Can you provide assurances that I can share with my students? And I think those assurances are around the privacy and confidentiality of their personal data. Kim, let me come to you first, and then LaToya, if you have anything else to add, I want to make sure you have a chance to do that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So the workforce development grantees generally are keeping copies of some of they don't actually have to in all cases, but often are keeping copies of something that they look at to make an eligibility determination in their files. There's lots of privacy requirements in our own grant programs. I will say work authorization status is not an element in the Pearl. So it's not something that is systemically collected. And our guidance makes clear that actually validating work, our grantees need to validate work authorization, right? Like look at it, but don't need to keep a copy of it. In many cases, it's not even so easy to make a copy because the way that they're validating is by like looking at like an online DHS resource. So they're not necessarily even like keeping a copy of something. And so there's, it's not tracked in our record layout. And people don't need to be keeping copies of the work authorization documentation. I think that like the fear that's out there is an understandable fear. And I would also want, for any state and local officials that are out there, like we all need to continue to make sure that we are abiding by the privacy requirements and the PII protection requirements that are in our grant documents. And, I'm not in any way trying to make light of the genuine fear here, but like, let's also think about like the real challenges that we have to share information when we want to. Like when we've got two different systems that want to be sharing a common customer and are so protective of their own information that they won't release it. And so there is a lot of, that's generally a downside, but in cases where we're worried about sharing sort of outside, like most workforce practitioners in states don't even want to share with like a neighboring, with a neighboring agency, let alone a being able to share it sort of more broadly outside the scope of workforce development. But it's a real fear. It's an understandable fear.
LaToya, I just want to give you the chance in case there's anything you want to add.
Sure. I just wanted to add it here at the federal level on the Title II side that our records, what we collect on the federal side are aggregate. So we're unable to disaggregate any of that information to share with anyone. So it kind of alleviates the fear from the federal side, but I ditto everything Kim shared earlier.
Yeah, so one quick thing I'll just add, because I know folks are all over the country with all different policies. Your local board or your local state education agency may require the collection of information that is actually not required under federal law. And so for some of you, you may be thinking there are federal requirements, but it's actually a more localized requirement. The other thing I'll just say, and I'll say this as someone who worked for 9 years for an immigrant serving organization, you can't share information that hasn't been collected, right? And so if you're not documenting someone's specific work authorization or lack of work authorization, that information can't be collected, right? So that is an important thing to keep in mind, right? You want to abide by federal regulations in regard to information that you're required to collect, but that does not mean that you need to go above and beyond federal regulations to collect information that you're not required to collect. And I think it's important to be mindful of that. Okay, so we have a couple of other questions here. So a couple of questions actually pertain to this question of sort of, well, what does it mean to actually use funds for barrier reduction, in particular, for example, for childcare costs? Becky, I'd want to let you chime in first and then give our federal partners a chance to weigh in if they'd like to. Is there anything in particular you'd like to share about how you've seen this work, or is this an area where you think you're starting to explore and you don't yet have a specific example to share?
Yeah, the work that we've done has been with a state-generated fund, so I think I would defer to LaToya on how she's rolling out. Yeah.
Okay, LaToya.
Thank you so much for bringing that back over. Again, we don't have a large number of states that have utilized this provision in the policy so far. What I have seen, though, that some states may have a capped amount that individuals may use. But in that guidance itself, it really talks about looking at the fair market value of childcare, how it's related to the programming. And if individuals are setting caps, they need to make sure that they specify that this is state-specific caps that are set. It's not set by the federal government. So I really would say reference the policy, reference that program memorandum, and it does give you some links and some guidance. Once the link is working, and I'll make sure Bethel has a correct link that if it's not working, we'll make sure that you get that. But those are some of the things that we have seen that individuals may set caps for, the amounts individuals are able to use, as long as it is not supplanting funds that are already being utilized for those types of things, such as childcare and transportation.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know for a lot of us, we're in this brave new world now where people use Venmo and Cash App and all kinds of non-formal ways to transfer money. And I will just say that a lot of accountants and auditors have been developing practices and policies to help nonprofit organizations figure out how to document when they are administering funds, and they need to be able to show have the internal financial controls and show the paper trail of how and why money has been dispersed. So if you haven't already talked to your accountant, that would be a good conversation to have. Okay, so we have a great question here from David Rosen. He's asking whether there's anything in the WIOA statute that would prevent an American Job Center from having adult education teachers. He's saying outstationed. I would call this co-located in a job center. And I think the short answer is no, there's absolutely nothing in the legislation that prevents it. And in theory, the legislation is supposed to encourage it, but in practice, that doesn't really happen. But I'd be curious to hear from the federal perspective, perhaps Kim first because of DOL's role with the one-stop centers, and then LaToya from the Title II side, what you would want to emphasize about this question.
Sure. Yeah, it is. It can be a tough nut to crack. I would say that it is delightful and shocking, like the variety of partners that are and are not present in American Job Centers across the country. So wherever you might not have seen something, like it is available and happening and alive in another job center. There are some genuine challenges, though, to making co-location work. I mean, one is that the statute sets requirements for every one-stop partner, these that weren't necessarily in place in WIA, its precursor, where one-stop partners that are regularly going to be present in an American Job Center have to sign an MOA with a local board. And it's not that the local board MOA is necessarily has to be a big scary thing, but that is an administrative thing, like a hoop to jump through. And all one-stop partners are supposed to be contributing towards the infrastructure of the one-stop. That's in statute, and that's worked out in the memorandum of agreement. Infrastructure funding agreements. Again, there are states and local areas that have got that down to a science, and they know how to facilitate that. But those are hard. Those are hard things to do. And so somebody who's just sort of like trying to get something like, okay, next week I'm going to come in. There's thinking about it as a co-location, like a one-stop partner actually has some statutory requirements associated with it. Having sort of like services present, I don't know, there's places also that sort of get around the one-stop partner concept. And instead of talking about it as a permanent presence, which does trigger all these requirements, more just like I'm bringing in this, the service. We're going to do, we're going to do resume writing today. We're going to do like recap of certain skills. We're going to have service providers in instead of talking about it as a one-stop partner as a way to facilitate more presence of a wider variety of services in the job center. But LaToya, I don't know if you had like a different take on that.
No, just utilizing what was when I was in the state, making sure that you're utilizing your state directors for those conversations if you're having those difficulties. If you're not located, making sure that there's direct linkage or access points to have those services, have access to those services. That was very important. And we saw a lot of that in our state. And it, like you said, it varies across the different local areas, but ensuring that you have those conversations and using your advocates to make sure that those services, if they're not present in those American Job Centers, that there's direct linkage or access points to those services.
And I just want to add, 4 of the 10 of the centers in Cook County are in a community college, and we see it as a best practice. And so one is in the process of moving like Monday into a community college location. And I also see a comment about some of the centers not being conducive for classes. And sometimes we have like a class across the street from an American Job Center. So there's a lot of different ways that people are, making it work, because adult ed is such a critical piece of making this whole AJC system work.
I love it. I like to think about this as, some folks are gatekeepers, and they're going to say, everything that's not specifically allowed in written down policy must be forbidden. And some people are evangelists in the non-religious sense of the word, and they're going to say anything that's not specifically forbidden on paper must be allowed. Let's do it. And so as you're looking for your partners on the ground, look for those folks who are evangelists about wanting to find creative ways to serve adult learners, and find creative ways to move around the gatekeepers who are perhaps starting from a place of more skepticism or resistance. Okay, so I want to combine a couple of questions here. There's a comment from Grayla in the Q&A. In my experience, it appears that in most cases, Title II partners are the ones pursuing partnership with Title I. WIOA requires that we work together. How can the barriers be addressed and removed starting from the top down? And I'm going to kind of tag team that with a question I had for you, Kim, which is, how has DOL been educating Title I partners about the new guidance?
Sure. I think that sort of like the notion of who's sort of moving where is a really tough one, and is part of every relationship. And it wouldn't surprise you to learn that there are also partners that wish that they could you know, have a different relationship with their partner. It's easy for multiple sides of a partnership to sort of miss an opportunity to understand the perspective of the other. So, I mean, I'm always just really careful not to make generalizations about, you know, Title I always does this, Title II always does that. Like that just doesn't serve us. And it's not really backed up by data. But you know, so what have we been doing to make sure that Title I, not just states and locals, but practitioners also understand the availability of the guidance? You know, for starters, we do webinars like this with our own workforce system and the Title I and Title III grantees. We've also met, you know, a lot of what we name is sort of about how state policies or local policies can change. So we also make sure to spend a lot of time with state policymakers. And so we've done that by working, you know, we meet with, and NGA brings state leaders together. NASWA brings state together. I'm naming different NASWA is the National Association of State Workforce Agencies. Our regional administrators bring states together for conversations. I think I've probably personally talked to almost every state director in the country now at one of these different places to go. DOL also has really been trying to make sure that we're showing up at places where local areas are gathering. So our regional offices will go out to state like associations of local areas, right? So that we can get, we've been at NADEP, a whole group of folks went there, National Association of Workforce Development Providers. So we're trying to go to where the people are. We're trying to make specifically connections with state policy makers, many of whom have been very, very interested in making these changes. And just like it kind of took us a couple months to actually write and clear and tidy up our guidance to get all the way out to the public. Even if you haven't seen it sort of instantaneously from in-state policy changes, like I can assure you there's been a lot of states that have been very interested in asking a lot of questions that are working on things, that they also want to be careful with their guidance. But, you know, sort of trying to get out there and meet with the states and locals where they are is some of how DOL has been trying to get the good word out.
And I'll jump in real quick too, Amanda. I think one of the things that is a common misconception is that we don't talk at the federal level. Kim and I are on a weekly meeting. We're constantly having that. And when we have our national meetings or our annual state directors meeting, we're very intentional about inviting our partners from all of the title partners to come in and share information with our stakeholder groups. So many of these meetings that can happen and individuals can continue to see the level of relationship that we're having at the top and permeating down throughout the system, because we are, as Title II partners, a critical part of this workforce system and letting everyone know what we actually bring to the table. So we have to be intentional about the programs and services that Title II can offer to individuals and how we are a valuable part, not just a required partner, but a valued partner within this workforce system. So I just wanted to share that.
I'm going to ask each of my panelists to leave you with one word that they want you to walk away from this webinar with. Don't overthink it. You don't have to be perfectionistic. Just one word you want folks to take away. While you're thinking of your one word, I'm going to again thank Sharon, Bonnie, and the whole team at COABE, including Mariah and Bethel, for their work behind the scenes to make sure that today's webinar went smoothly. I want to thank Robert and Burlington English for their support of this webinar series. We could have gone a lot longer. We chose to keep this as a 1-hour webinar. If you have feedback about wanting follow-up conversation on this, I know COABE will be excited to hear that. So one word close out from each of my panelists, and then I'll turn it back over to Robert and we'll close out. Becky, one word.
I'd say curious.
All right, curious. I love it. Kim.
Hashtag yes, WIOA can.
All right, Latoya.
Fortitude.
Fortitude. All right, I'm going to say courage. And Robert?
If you've known me for more than a second, I can't do that for less. Thank you to everyone here. Thank you. And please know, once again, COABE does a fantastic job of archiving this webinar and all of the resources. We've got the link. All you have to do is Google, just search for COABE webinars. You'll see all the fantastic information that was shared today and PowerPoints and resources. And bravo to you all, and from my colleagues and all of us at Burlington English. We'd love to help you make the most of the information you heard today. But thank you to our amazing panelists.
Thank you again. Take care, everyone.
Thanks.